All right, Genesis chapter 26 is where we are in this episode. Now the scene, whereas last episode the focus was much more on Jacob and Esau, especially at the end of the chapter. Genesis chapter 26, the scene shifts back to Isaac, the father of Jacob and Esau, and really focuses on God's promise to Isaac and how God was faithful and how God kept his promise, even when Isaac's faith wavered at times, as we'll see in this chapter. So beginning in Genesis chapter 26, verse 1 through 5, we have God making a promise to Isaac. It says, "There was a famine in the land, besides the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, in Gerar. Then the Lord appeared to him and said, 'Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land of which I shall tell you. Dwell in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I give all these lands, and I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. And I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give to your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws.'" So, another famine strikes the land. The first one since the one we read about in Genesis chapter 12, verse 10. Now, to do a little math at this point, don't worry, I'm going to hopefully correctly do the math for you. Abraham, back in Genesis chapter 12, verse 4, Abraham was 75 years old when he left Haran for Canaan. Now, that's also when we read of the first famine, was in that chapter. So Abraham was 75 years old then. You skip forward to Genesis chapter 21, verse 5, Abraham is 100 years old when Isaac is born. Then Isaac is 60 years old when his sons Jacob and Esau were born, back in Genesis chapter 25. So, think about the timeline there. Abraham's 75, 25 years pass until the time Isaac is born. Then 60 more years pass before Jacob and Esau are born. Abraham dies at 175 years old, and if my math is right, when Abraham died, Jacob and Esau were both 15 years old, and Isaac was 75 years old, Genesis 25, verse 7. So that's an interesting detail that maybe you've never noticed before, is that Jacob and Esau did know Abraham. They got to know him, they got to meet him. Families like this lived together and traveled together. So the first 15 years of their life, Jacob and Esau would have been around Abraham probably a pretty good bit. So, but anyway, the reason I bring all this up is it sounds like, from the way this chapter begins in Genesis 26, that this second famine happens after the days of Abraham, because it says there was a famine besides the first famine that happened in the days of Abraham. During his life, there was a famine, and the writer's saying this is a different famine. So this second famine, if my math is right, this second famine is likely at least 100 years after the famine we read about in Genesis chapter 12, verse 10. It's also likely, or at least it's very possible, that this chapter, if a lot of us in the United States, we think in terms of chronological order of things. It's very likely that from a chronological perspective, Genesis 26 actually happens before at least some of the events of Genesis chapter 25. Most things in Genesis are in chronological order, but not everything. Sometimes the writer will mention something and then he'll skip back in time to focus more on an event that happens. So that's just something to keep in mind as far as the timeline of events there. So Isaac, what we read in Genesis 26, he goes down to Abimelech, which Abimelech was probably not actually this fella's name. It was probably the Philistine title for their king, like the Egyptians used Pharaoh. Abimelech was probably a title similar to Pharaoh. He goes down to Abimelech, the Philistine king, in Gerar. And there the Lord appears to Isaac and commands him not to go down to Egypt. Now, why would God tell Isaac that? Well, We know that's where Abraham had gone in the first famine in Genesis chapter 12, verse 10. We don't know if that move by Abraham had been against the will of God, but now he for sure makes his will known to Isaac here. He outright tells Isaac, do not go down to Egypt. And the Lord repeats the promises he made to Abraham. He repeats those to Isaac. He said, I made these promises to your father, and he obeyed me. I'm extending the promises to you. You also obey me. He tells him to trust him. And he's basically, God tells Isaac, trust me, don't go down to Egypt. Now, Isaac is living evidence that the Lord keeps his promises. Isaac had been born when his father was 100, his mother was 99. He's living evidence that the Lord keeps his promises. Isaac's boys, Jacob and Esau, are also living evidence that the Lord keeps his promises to Isaac as well. And so, as we continue on, in Genesis 26, we find that Isaac does indeed do what God tells him to do. So Isaac dwelt in Gerar, and the men of the place asked about his wife, and he said, she is my sister. For he was afraid to say, she is my wife, because he thought, lest the men of the place kill me for Rebekah, because she is beautiful to behold. Now it came to pass, when he had been there a long time, that Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked through a window and saw, and there was Isaac, showing endearment to Rebekah his wife. Then Abimelech called Isaac and said, quite obviously she is your wife. So how could you say she is my sister? Isaac said to him, because I said, lest I die on account of her. And Abimelech said, what is this you have done to us? One of the people might soon have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt on us. So Abimelech charged all his people, saying, he who touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. Just as Abraham had once done, Isaac lives in Gerar. Genesis 20, verse 1 is when Abraham had done it. And also, just as Abraham had lied about his relationship with his wife, Abraham actually did this twice, in Genesis 12, down in Egypt, and in Genesis 20, with Abimelech. So Isaac does the same thing for the same reason. Now, the difference here is that Abimelech noticed Isaac showing endearment to Rebekah. Some translations here have a fondling or caressing. I guess without going into great detail or without knowing exactly what all that included, it's, as Abimelech said, quite obviously, she is your wife. Quite obviously, this woman is not your sister, but she is, in fact, your wife. So after calling attention to Isaac's lie, Abimelech forbids his people from touching Isaac or Rebekah in either a violent or a sexual way. And if anyone disobeyed this command, they would die. Michael Whitworth, at this point, in his book, The Epic of God, said that Isaac was discovering that it's one thing to stand in awe as God reaffirms to you the blessing of the ages. It's quite another thing altogether to live in light of that blessing in the cruel, hard world of reality. God's people have always been called to walk by faith and not by sight, 2 Corinthians 5, verse 7. God has made his promises to Isaac, and while no doubt that was amazing, now here in the real world, so to speak, it's not always the easiest thing to do, to live in light of those promises. And so, as we read on, then Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him. The man began to prosper and continued prospering until he became very prosperous, for he had possessions of flocks and possessions of herds and a great number of servants. So the Philistines envied him. Now the Philistines had stopped up all the wells which his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham his father, and they had filled them with earth. And Abimelech said to Isaac, go away from us, for you are much mightier than we. Then Isaac departed from there and pitched his tent in the valley of Gerar and dwelt there. So despite Isaac's faithlessness in the promises of God on this occasion, God remained faithful to Isaac. 2 Timothy 2, verse 13. Isaac's harvest, he is going to start farming and his harvest was 100 times what he had planted. This was obviously the Lord's blessing. The highest crop return recorded in documents from this period of history is 75 times, and Isaac's crop of 100-fold was in the middle of a famine. So Isaac is once again reminded that God is faithful and he keeps his promises. Now, as Isaac's wealth grew, so did his problems with the locals. Hamilton, in his commentary on the book of Genesis, said, "Whenever an outsider moves in and becomes very prosperous in someone else's backyard, the natives feel resentment." And that's what you see here. The Philistines see this outsider come in, live among them, and grow far more wealthy than any of them. And the envy of the Philistines led them to stop up the wells that Abraham had dug, which rightfully belonged to Isaac. Wells were an extremely valuable resource in this society of, growing crops and raising livestock. You had to have wells, you had to have water, or your business quite literally dried up. But here we learn something interesting about Isaac. He was mightier than the Philistines. They had spitefully filled in the wells that were rightfully his, and instead of fighting, he chose to leave peacefully. And Isaac, continuing on in our text, "And Isaac dug again the wells of water which they had dug in the days of Abraham his father, for the Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham. He called them by the names which his father had called them. Also Isaac's servants dug in the valley and found a well of running water there. But the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen, saying, 'The water is ours.' So he called the name of the well Esek, because they quarreled with him. Then they dug another well, and they quarreled over that one also. And so he called its name Sitnah. And he moved from there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it. So he called its name Rehoboth, because he said, 'For now the Lord has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land.'" So Isaac moves off a little ways from everyone, and he has his servants dig more wells. He calls them by the same name that Abraham had called the wells the Philistines had stopped up. One of these wells contained a spring, which was immensely valuable since the well would keep producing water. However, the Philistines quarrel over this well. So Isaac changes its name to Esek, which means strife, and he digs another well. But the Philistines quarrel over that well too, so Isaac named it Sitnah, which means accusation, and he moves on again to dig another well. But this time, nobody quarreled with Isaac over the third well he dug, or over this final well. So Isaac named it Rehoboth, which means wide open spaces. Basically, it's the name of the well means that God had made room for him in the land. And so then continuing back on in our text, it says, after all of that fiasco with the wells, then he went up from there to Beersheba, and the Lord appeared to him the same night and said, "I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your descendants for my servant Abraham's sake." So he built an altar there and called on the name of the Lord, and he pitched his tent there, and there Isaac's servants dug a well. Eventually, Isaac moves to Beersheba, and the Lord appears to him and reaffirms the promises that he had made to Abraham. And Isaac responds just as his father Abraham had done. He builds an altar, and he calls on the name of the Lord. Abraham does this back in Genesis 12, verse 8, and also in Genesis 13, verse 8. Isaac sets up his home base here. He digs a well, he builds an altar, he settles in here in Beersheba. So then, after all of this, he's become very prosperous. He's been forced out of town. The Philistines have quarreled with him over the wells. Finally, he has room. Finally, he can kind of settle in. And then Abimelech shows up, the king of the Philistines, came to him from Gerar with Ahuzzath, one of his friends, and Phicol, the commander of his army. And Isaac said to them, "Why have you come to me, since you hate me and have sent me away from you?" But they said, "We have certainly seen that the Lord is with you." And so we said, "Let there now be an oath between us, between you and us. Let us make a covenant with you that you will do us no harm, since we have not touched you, and since we have done nothing to you but good and have sent you away in peace. You are now the blessed of the Lord." So he made them a feast, and they ate and drank. Then they arose early in the morning and swore an oath with one another, and Isaac sent them away, and they departed from him in peace. So, here Abimelech arrives with one of his friends and the commander of the army. Probably his friend was probably an advisor of some sort, and he's wanting to make a treaty. Just as had happened with Abraham years earlier, they're wanting to make this covenant, this treaty between them. And Isaac, at first, he calls them out for their envy, how they had treated him. But he ends up sitting down to a feast with them, which was part of making a treaty. Here, either Abimelech doesn't know about how his people had wronged Isaac, or he ignores it. But either way, Isaac decides to go ahead and go through with this treaty, where they would not harm Isaac and Isaac would not harm them. And so as we continue on, after this treaty is made, it came to pass the same day that Isaac's servants came and told him about the well which they had dug, and said to him, "We have found water." So he called it Sheba. Therefore the name of the city is Beersheba to this day. On the same day that the treaty is made with Abimelech, Isaac's servants tell him about the well that they had dug. Isaac calls it Sheba, which means 7 or completion. Beersheba means well of an oath. It was a reminder of both God's promises to Isaac and how he had kept his promises, and also of the treaty between Isaac and Abimelech. And so we see God caring for Isaac and keeping his promises and being faithful to him through all of this that's going on in Isaac's life. And then at the end of the chapter, we see an interesting little detail. Genesis 26, verse 34 through 35, we read about Esau and his wives. When Esau was 40 years old, he took his wives Judith, the daughter of Beri the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. And they were a grief of mind to Isaac and Rebekah. There are several ways that we have read so far in which Esau acted very differently from Abraham and Isaac. First of all, he married daughters of the Hittites, the people of the land. Abraham did not want this for Isaac, and Isaac did not want this for Esau. Esau also, in addition to marrying from the people of the land, Esau also marries 2 women. Now, we have seen problems come from this before the flood, back in Genesis chapter 6. We also have seen Abraham's decision in Genesis chapter 16 to get involved with Hagar. Nothing but problems have come from marrying multiple women. We also see that Esau did not allow his parents to arrange his marriage, which is common in this time, which was something that Abraham arranged for his son Isaac. But Esau, I think we're beginning to get the idea here that Esau is very stubborn and hard-headed. Esau is going to do what Esau wants to do, and he doesn't really think through the consequences of his actions. We've seen that already in this book, and we're going to see it some more in the life of Esau. So that's Genesis chapter 26. Most of it focuses on how God keeps his promises to Isaac, how he remains faithful to Isaac through the ups and the downs, even through really times when Esau wavers in his faithfulness to God. God is still there, and God is still keeping his promises. Also, at the end, we see, although Isaac is someone who is submitting himself to the will of God, we keep seeing Esau pop up as someone who does what he wants to do. And that's going to be important as we go on in this book. So I appreciate you studying Genesis chapter 26 with me. Lord willing, next time we'll get into Genesis chapter 27, where the scene is going to shift, I suppose, pretty much permanently from here on, from Isaac to Jacob and his family. So I look forward to studying Genesis chapter 27 with you next time, and until then, hope you have a good rest of your day.